Today we continue our journey into Wolf Creek 2. The story once again unfolds in the vast emptiness of Western Australia. Every year, around 30,000 people disappear in this region. While 90% are eventually found, the remaining 10% vanish forever. Today, 2 policemen are on duty along a deserted highway, checking for drunk drivers and speeding vehicles. But they've been waiting for hours without seeing a single car pass by. Suddenly, the officers notice the distant sound of a vehicle approaching. As the vehicle drives past, the older officer quickly activates his radar gun. Disappointed, they find the driver wasn't speeding at all. Frustrated since it's nearing the year's end and needing to meet their quotas, the older officer decides to chase down the vehicle and issue a ticket anyway. After all, he says, the driver won't know whether he was speeding or not. Out here, our word is law. They quickly speed up to catch the driver. The man behind the wheel is none other than Mick, the notorious villain from the first Wolf Creek film. Spotting the police car behind him, Mick discreetly prepares his knife but reluctantly pulls over to avoid suspicion. He steps out of his vehicle, confused. The older officer immediately accuses Mick of driving over 100 kilometers per hour, claiming he was speeding. Mick calmly insists it's impossible. He knows exactly how fast he was driving. Clearly, the officers are setting him up. Mick sees no reason to argue and turns to leave, but the older officer stops him, saying it'd be rude to leave without taking a ticket. Inspecting Mick's license, the officer notices he's from a rural area and arrogantly begins to belittle him. He even insults Mick's family, treating him with open contempt. Barely suppressing his rage, Mick quietly accepts the ticket with a forced smile. Satisfied, the 2 policemen drive away laughing. But as Mick watches the patrol car disappear into the distance, his anger explodes. Suddenly, with a violent crash, their police car flips through the air, sending both officers tumbling, injured and bleeding. Mick approaches them, carrying a can of gasoline. Noticing the older officer is still alive. With cold brutality, Mick snaps the officer's ankle and drags him beside the wrecked vehicle. Whispering chillingly, "I'm a hunter, and I hunt pigs." He swiftly cuts through the officer's spine, leaving him paralyzed and unable to move. Placing him inside the car, Mick then douses it in gasoline. The officer desperately begs Mick for mercy, but Mick simply smiles and sets the vehicle ablaze. The scene now shifts to a young couple, Rutger and Katarina. They're backpacking along the endless highway, hoping to reach Wolf Creek Park, eager to experience an adventure. Traveling without their own car, they rely entirely on the kindness of passing drivers. In the distance, they see a pickup truck approaching. Rutger waves to hitch a ride, and to their relief, the truck slows down. But just as they approach, a larger truck appears behind it, prompting the pickup driver to speed off quickly. Forced to improvise, the young couple signals the second vehicle instead. Luckily, this driver agrees to give them a lift, eventually dropping them off at an intersection 2 kilometers from their destination. As night is already falling, the couple decides to set up camp and resume their journey early the next morning. The following day, another kind stranger gives them a ride to the park's entrance. After hiking for 3 long hours, they finally arrive at the impressive Wolf Creek crater. Seeing the breathtaking view, they excitedly shout into the vast sky. Here they encounter other tourists also enjoying the scenery, but the joy of seeing the crater quickly fades away, and soon they head back to the main road, hoping to hitch a ride to town. This time, however, the passing cars refuse to stop. Frustrated, Rutger angrily curses at the vehicles passing by. Katarina gently calms him, urging patience as they continue walking, hopeful another friendly driver will appear soon. But as darkness descends, no vehicle appears, and they're forced once again to camp by the roadside. Late at night, as the 2 lie inside their tent, they suddenly hear the engine of a vehicle approaching. Rutger quickly puts on his clothes and steps outside to investigate, only to meet Mick standing there sternly. Mick scolds them harshly. "Do you think this is a hotel? You're inside a national park. Campfires aren't allowed here." Rutger tries nervously to explain that they had no choice. Hearing voices, Katarina peeks out from the tent. Seeing her, Mick changes his tone, pretending friendliness, explaining he's headed to town and could give them a lift. "Staying here overnight isn't safe," Mick warns, "and camping is actually prohibited." But Rutger feels suspicious, recalling clearly that camping was allowed on their map. In caution, Rutger firmly rejects Mick's offer, whispering quietly to Katarina to secretly call for help. Realizing his deception isn't working, Mick quickly drops his friendly facade, revealing his true violent nature. Without hesitation, he slams Rutger against his vehicle and viciously stabs him with his knife. Rutger collapses in agony, severely injured. Hearing Rutger's painful screams, Katarina rushes out of the tent to help. But Mick swiftly grabs her, pinning her down and warning her not to resist. "I plan to let you both live," he growls menacingly. "But your boyfriend insisted on being stubborn. You brought this upon yourselves." With cruel intentions, Mick prepares to assault Katarina. Just as Mick moves closer, Rutger, finding a sudden burst of strength, attacks Mick from behind, striking him with a stick. Unfortunately, this small attack does little harm to Mick. Furious, Mick turns around and brutally punches Rutger in the side, causing him to collapse again, this time immobilized completely. To further intimidate Katarina, Mick forces her to watch as he cruelly ends Rutger's life right in front of her. The horrific sight leaves Katarina frozen in absolute terror. Deciding he has plenty of time ahead, Mick knocks Katarina unconscious, planning to deal with her later. When Katarina eventually wakes up, she's horrified to see Mick nearby, disposing of Rutger's remains. Seizing a moment of distraction, Katarina bravely escapes into the night. When Mick notices her disappearance, he's not worried in the slightest. "If you want to play hide and seek," Mick chuckles darkly, "I'll happily play along." Mick immediately jumped into his truck, chasing after Katarina and taunting her relentlessly as he drove. Seeing this, Katarina quickly dove into dense bushes, effectively preventing Mick's vehicle from following her directly. She ran frantically through the undergrowth until she reached the main road, where luckily she spotted a passing driver. The driver saw the badly injured Katarina and quickly helped her into his car, determined to get her out of danger. Unfortunately, Mick arrived just in time to see Katarina escape. An intense chase erupted on the open highway. Mick's truck was heavily modified, easily catching up with them. Realizing he had no chance to outrun Mick on the highway, the driver desperately turned onto a small side road. But Mick slammed on the accelerator, violently crashing into their car and forcing it to stop. Stepping out of his truck, Mick took out his weapon and fired without hesitation. The driver instinctively ducked, but the bullet tragically struck Katarina instead. Seeing this, the driver panicked completely, quickly turning his car around to flee. Mick fired again but missed his shot this time, allowing the driver to narrowly escape death. When dawn arrived, the driver sadly laid Katarina's body in an open field, carefully covering and burying her in a makeshift grave. Afterward, the driver drove to a more populated area, but since he was completely unfamiliar with the place, he had no idea where the nearest police station was. Desperate, he stopped his car, seeking help from passing vehicles, but nobody stopped or paid him any attention, leaving him totally broken. Just then, a large tow truck appeared on the road behind him. He waved desperately for help once more, but as it got closer, he saw clearly it was Mick himself. Terrified, he immediately turned and began running for his life, with Mick closely pursuing him. His small Jeep seemed hopelessly vulnerable compared to Mick's massive tow truck. Just as Mick was about to catch him, the driver reached an uphill slope. Here, his tiny Jeep proved slightly more agile than the heavy tow truck, giving him momentary hope. However, at that critical moment, his Jeep suffered a sudden tire blowout, causing him to lose control and plunge off the cliff. Fortunately, the airbags deployed, saving his life. Surviving the crash, he began mocking Mick, believing he had escaped once again. But Mick wasn't in the tow truck. He was calmly standing atop the cliff, looking down at the driver below. Mick had every chance to finish him off right there, yet chose not to. For Mick, this was simply a game. The driver, injured and exhausted, began dragging himself through the endless wilderness. Without a map or food, he quickly grew weak and eventually collapsed, unable to go on. But in his final moments of consciousness, he saw salvation ahead, a small house. Summoning all his remaining strength, he reached the doorstep before collapsing completely. When he finally woke up again, he was lying safely in a warm bed. The owner of the house had even kindly provided fresh clothes for him. The house belonged to an elderly couple. They helped him up gently, urging him to eat something immediately. The older man explained he'd be heading into town soon and could take him along. Desperate, the driver asked to use the phone to call for help, but was told there was no telephone here, and the only radio they had was broken. Feeling incredibly hungry, he didn't overthink and quickly started eating. He introduced himself as Paul and explained that he'd gone through something horrible, ending up at their home purely by chance. But before Paul could finish his meal, Mick's voice suddenly echoed from outside the house. Terrified, Paul leaped to his feet. The old man calmly reassured Paul, picking up a rifle and stepping outside, confronting Mick directly and ordering him to leave immediately. Seeing the older man was serious, Mick pretended to comply, backing off temporarily. But once the old man returned, Paul insisted that Mick would never give up easily. He urgently asked the old man for another weapon. However, when they opened the cabinet, the weapon was missing. Instead, a familiar sniper rifle appeared in its place. Hearing the sound of gunfire, the elderly woman came running into the room, realized the danger and tried to flee, but Mick instantly took her out as well. Paul seized this chance and fled outside. By the time Mick noticed, Paul had already put considerable distance between them. Fortunately for Mick, a black horse stood nearby, transforming him instantly into a Wild West cowboy. Mick chased Paul tirelessly from evening until darkness fell, finally catching up, violently knocking him down and whipping him mercilessly. After countless blows, Paul begged Mick for mercy. Ignoring his pleas, Mick simply knocked him unconscious. When Paul awoke again, he found himself tied tightly to a chair, helpless. He immediately apologized to Mick, saying he shouldn't have interfered or helped the woman, promising to forget everything if Mick would let him go. But Mick coldly replied, "This isn't a place you come and go whenever you please." Furious, Mick decided he'd punish Paul by cutting out his tongue. Thinking quickly, Paul started telling a series of jokes, desperately trying to distract Mick. Surprisingly, Mick found Paul genuinely funny, and they started having a casual conversation instead. Enjoying the talk, Mick left briefly to grab some drinks so they could continue. Paul seized this opportunity to free himself, but the ropes were tied too tightly and he couldn't break free. When Mick returned, Paul cleverly asked him to untie one hand so he could drink more comfortably. Mick agreed, and the two chatted and drank together for hours, even singing songs from their hometowns. Seeing how intelligent Paul was, Mick suggested playing a trivia game. 10 questions. If Paul could correctly answer at least 5, he'd be set free. But every wrong answer would cost him 1 finger. Each finger represented a question. With everything prepared, Mick began the cruel game show. The first question asked for the name of an iconic surf brand word that originally meant damn. Paul luckily got it right immediately. The second question, when did the British first settle in Australia? Without hesitation, Paul answered correctly, January 26, 1788. Impressed, Mick asked how Paul knew so much, to which Paul revealed he majored in history. To celebrate, Mick poured him another drink. The third question asked when Britain started sending convicts to Australia. Paul confidently answered 1790 and 1791, earning another correct answer. But Mick then aggressively questioned Paul further, asking why the British sent prisoners to Australia, threatening him with a chainsaw. Paul nervously explained that after losing their original colonies, Britain needed somewhere to send prisoners, as overcrowding led to diseases and wasted resources. Enraged, Mick suddenly declared Paul wrong and immediately cut off one of Paul's fingers, explaining afterward that the real reason was simply because they were British. Though Paul's facts were correct, Mick simply didn't like the answer. Next, Mick asked who Australia's most famous basketball player was. Paul admitted he had no idea, begging Mick to cut a finger from his other hand instead. Mick agreed, but after finishing, he realized they'd run out of drinks and went out to get more. Taking advantage of Mick's absence, Paul grabbed a hammer from the table, hiding it nearby. When Mick returned, he had no intention of releasing Paul. Instead, Mick decided Paul would replace Katarina since he'd lost his toy.
You're just gonna have to stand in for a bit, okie dokie.
Paul immediately attacked Mick with the hidden hammer, injuring him and breaking free from his leg restraints. But just before finishing Mick off, Mick suddenly woke up. Paul grabbed a flashlight, fleeing quickly. He discovered the room was an underground bunker, filled horrifyingly with multiple bodies of Mick's past victims. Realizing he was exposed, Paul turned to escape, desperately searching for an exit. Just as freedom seemed close, Mick released 2 aggressive dogs after him. Paul triggered a hidden trap, killing one dog instantly. Pulling back a black curtain revealed a pit filled with sharp spikes, blocking his escape route. Seeing Mick approaching, Paul hid, launching a sudden attack when Mick appeared, but instead struck a woman who'd been barely alive, finishing her off. Horrified, Paul froze as Mick grabbed him again from behind.
You're nothing but foreign vermin, a stinking introduced species. And it's up to my kind to wipe your kind out. And that makes me the winner, which makes you.
Paul later awoke in a small town, realizing Mick had left him there alive, along with a mocking note. Mick had kept his word, technically granting Paul his life. Paul was rescued and hospitalized, recounting the terrible events to police. But during investigations, Paul's mind completely broke down, leading him to permanent medical care. Police found no clues whatsoever. Thus, Wolf Creek 2 ends here, leaving everything unresolved.